How can we make a Soviet city in TheoTown? Well, first, we'd have to examine the ideas behind a Soviet city. After World War II, a lot of Soviet infrastructure was left destroyed, and the Soviet government faced the Herculean task of providing housing to nearly 200 million people, as housing was guaranteed as a right under the Soviet constitution. There were several elements that the Soviets considered when designing their city, but by far the most prioritized was cost and efficiency. This principle often favored copy and paste panel housing instead of individual, private housing like we see in the West. We also have to consider the ideological element of it, as Soviet cities were made to reflect Marxist-Leninist ideals through a collectivist lifestyle. Unlike Western cities, which were often centralized, Soviet cities were decentralized. What this meant was that every city resident usually had equal access to daily necessities like schools, daycares, shops, and recreational facilities. This was achieved through a concept known as a mikrorayon, or microdistrict. A microdistrict was basically just a big city block that housed around 8,000 to 12,000 people, and where all daily necessities were within walking distance for its residents. Now, I'd like to talk about the actual apartment buildings, because I think they're really interesting. Soviet buildings were generally categorized by the name of the Soviet leader in power at the time they were built. Buildings designed under Stalin's rule were called Stalinkas. Buildings designed under Khrushchev's rule were called Khrushchevkas. Buildings made under Brezhnev's rule were called Brezhnevkas, and so on. Apart from the names, these buildings also had distinct design features that set them apart. Stalinkas, although small, were built elegantly and featured ornate designs. These buildings are found all over Moscow and St. Petersburg. Khrushchevkas were larger than Stalinkas, but no more than 5 stories tall. They were built to be more functional and didn't have decorations like Stalinkas. They were also way more common throughout the Eastern Bloc. And Brezhnevkas were just larger Khrushchevkas. They were taller, had more square footage, and usually featured elevators, unlike Khrushchevkas. Connecting micro-districts to each other, arterial roads were the main roads of the Soviet city. They also added to the city's spaciousness by typically being oversized. I already had the road layout planned, and all I had to do now was to polish it by adding road markings and traffic lights. Now that we have the road layout set up, we can finally start adding buildings, but first we need the absolute necessities. I've built a coal power plant right here so that our city can have a power supply. Additionally, we have a water filtration plant and a water tower so that our citizens can have water. Let's construct some micro-districts. First, we place the Khrushchevkas in patterns that look like Tetris pieces. Next, I went ahead and added schools to each micro-district and a sports facility to go along with them. For this one, I added a football field, and for this one, I added a basketball court. I don't know how common basketball was in the Soviet Union, but I want my citizens to have a little bit of diversity. There were often shops placed right next to the Khrushchevkas in the form of small, standalone buildings, and that's what I'm putting down here. Next, it was time to build services that weren't necessarily needed every day. Things like fire departments, hospitals, and police stations. These were usually built strategically within reach of multiple micro-districts. So we're going to try to build them in between micro-districts so that we can try to get as many people as we can covered by their effective radius. Next, we needed to give our citizens some work. And what better place is there to work than a cement factory? So I've built a huge cement factory here that should employ most of the city. But in case it doesn't, I've built some other smaller factories here that should employ the rest. This city block will be special because it'll be the first one to have Brezhnevkas introduced, and they will tower over the rest of the buildings in the city. To make our city a little more interesting, I've decided to make a radio station and reserved some space for an administrative building. I've also added a research facility and some Ukrainian-style buildings just to give a little more flavor to our city. Our Soviet city is finally coming to life. We just need to add a few more finishing touches and some important details for it to be complete. Around the outskirts of the city, I added these village-looking areas with rural houses and dirt roads. And then we'll make a little square with a piece of communist propaganda. On the opposite side, at the end of the arterial road, we'll have a large statue in remembrance of the Great Patriotic War. And last but not least, we're going to add some farmland so that our citizens can export food to the rest of the country, as the vast majority of land in the USSR was not suitable for agriculture. And finally, we have our little Soviet city. Tell me what you like, what you dislike. I know a lot of my viewers come from Eastern Bloc countries, so tell me if this is accurate and would you live in this city? Thanks for watching.